They used my land as a dump site. 22 tons of excavated fill dirt, broken concrete chunks the size of microwaves, and enough rebar scraps to build a small cage, all piled on the back quarter-acre of my property, because Hargrove Estates HOA decided my fence line was close enough to their construction staging area. And when I called to complain, the HOA board president, a woman named Dolores Fitch, told me, and I am quoting her directly,
"Perhaps you should be grateful we're bringing development value to your neighborhood."
Grateful. She said that. Then she turned around and walked away. That was the biggest mistake Dolores Fitch ever made in her life. What would you do if an HOA dumped debris on your land and told you to be grateful? Drop it in the comments. And hey, where are you watching from tonight? Let's see how many states are dealing with HOA nonsense. My name is Garrett Wolfson, and I need to give you a little context before we get to the good part, because the good part is very, very good. I bought the 2-acre lot on Tulliver Road in Claremont County, Ohio back in 2009. It wasn't much to look at then. A beat-up craftsman house, a detached garage that smelled permanently of motor oil and regret, and a long, slightly sloping back lot that ran down to a creek-adjacent drainage easement. The price was right, the bones were solid, and I had plans. Big ones. I'd spent 28 years as a civil engineer for a mid-size infrastructure firm, the kind of company that built overpasses and water treatment facilities, and knew exactly what a load-bearing soil condition looked like from 1,000 yards. I understood drainage grades, setbacks, legal descriptions, and the sacred geometry of property surveys the way some men understand baseball stats. That detail becomes very important later. My wife Claudette and I raised 2 daughters in that house. We built a workshop in the back garage, planted a quarter-acre kitchen garden, and installed a small rain collection system that I am genuinely proud of. The creekside lot wasn't buildable. It sat in a floodplain buffer zone, but it was ours, and we maintained it carefully, mowed, graded, seeded with native grasses every spring. Then, in 2021, the parcel adjacent to us, a former cow pasture that had been sitting fallow for a decade, got purchased by a developer called Ridgecrest Residential Partners. They were going to build Hargrove Estates, 43 single-family homes, a clubhouse, a community pool, and, naturally, an HOA with the gravitational pull of a dying star when it comes to attracting small, petty people who want authority over their neighbors. Enter Dolores Fitch. Dolores was elected HOA president before a single house was even finished. A maneuver so aggressive, it should have been its own warning sign. She was 61, drove a white Cadillac Escalade, wore her reading glasses on a bedazzled chain, and had what I can only describe as the energy of someone who'd been waiting their entire life for a laminate badge that said President. She had previously served as the president of 2 other HOAs in the county, both of which had generated formal complaints with the Ohio HOA Dispute Resolution Program. I didn't know that last part yet. The first unfair act came in the spring of 2022, about 8 months into construction on the Ridgecrest project. I noticed tire tracks in my back lot, heavy equipment tracks, the kind a Caterpillar D6 bulldozer leaves in soft ground after rain. Then I noticed the ground itself was different, compacted, disturbed. A week later, the dump truck started. In the early morning, while I was having coffee on my back porch, I watched, genuinely, just watched with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, as a contractor backed a dump truck through the gap in my fence line, where a gate post had, I noticed for the first time, been removed, quietly, recently, and dumped a load of construction fill onto my property. The smell hit me before the visual fully processed. Wet concrete dust, diesel exhaust, and the particular chalky bite of disturbed clay subsoil. The gravel crunch of the truck tires on my native grass, the mechanical groan of the truck bed rising, the heavy wet slap of fill dirt landing in a pile that would eventually reach chest height. I set down my coffee. I called the HOA's general number, got voicemail, called the contractor's number on the side of the truck, a company called Statewide Grading and Excavation, got voicemail, called the county zoning office, got a very nice woman named Phyllis who told me to submit a written concern form online. 3 days later, I got a call back from Dolores Fitch herself. That was the conversation where she told me to be grateful. I took a very deep breath. I said, "Thank you for returning my call, Dolores," and I hung up the phone. And then I went into my workshop, pulled out my survey maps, my deed, my property description, and a legal pad. And I started writing things down. Over the next 2 weeks, the dumping continued. Not every day. They were smarter than that. It happened on Tuesdays and Thursdays, always before 7 in the morning, when the neighborhood was still half asleep, and the construction noise from the Ridgecrest site could mask the sound of their trucks on my property. 5 loads. Then 8. Then, by mid-April, I counted what I later confirmed was approximately 22 tons of mixed construction fill. Broken concrete, rebar scraps, excavated clay, and some absolutely spectacular chunks of asphalt that had clearly come from a demolished parking lot somewhere. My back lot, which I had spent years carefully managing, the native grass, the drainage grade I'd engineered specifically to prevent erosion toward the creek buffer, was now a debris field. Here's what they didn't know about me. I don't yell. I don't post on Facebook. I document. Starting on the morning of the 3rd truck visit, I set up a trail camera, the kind deer hunters use, zip-tied to a fence post with a clear sight line to the gap where my gate used to be. Timestamp enabled, motion activated, 4K resolution. I positioned a second one on the back corner of my garage, angled to catch license plates. I started photographing the debris piles every single morning with my phone, with a bright orange construction measuring stake visible in the frame for scale. I kept a written log, date, time, approximate volume, weather conditions, in a composition notebook I dated and initialed every page of. My civil engineering background was not decorating a wall. It was working. Because here's the thing about dumping fill on someone's property in Ohio. It's not a neighborhood dispute. It's not a miscommunication. Under Ohio Revised Code Section 3734-01 and related solid waste statutes, unlawful dumping of construction debris, which includes concrete, rebar, and excavated fill when it's deposited without a permit on land you don't own, can constitute illegal open dumping, a misdemeanor, with civil liability for remediation costs attached. Every load was a separate count. 22 tons, at the remediation rates I was already Googling, ran somewhere between $40,000 and $90,000 to properly remove and haul to a licensed facility. Takeaway. In most states, dumping construction debris on someone else's land, even just fill dirt, is illegal dumping with real civil and criminal consequences. I hadn't filed anything yet. I was still building my file, but I made one phone call in this period that I want to tell you about, because it mattered. I called my old colleague Bertrand Oxner. Bert had retired from our firm 3 years earlier and now ran a small private land survey practice. I asked him if he could come out and do a formal boundary survey of my property, specifically confirming the coordinates of my back lot line and the location of the original survey pins. Bert came out on a Saturday morning with his total station and his GPS receiver, wearing his ancient canvas hat and carrying a thermos of terrible coffee. He spent 4 hours in my back lot, poking around in the debris, and when he came back to my porch, his expression was the particular kind of flat that experienced surveyors get when they've found something interesting. "Garrett," he said, "you know they're not just on your property." I looked at him. "That back debris pile?" he said, pulling up his field notes. "It's sitting partially on the creek drainage easement, the county drainage easement. The county drainage easement. Not private, not HOA controlled. County infrastructure," which meant the Ohio Department of Transportation and the county engineer's office both had a statutory interest in keeping it clear. Which meant I was not, in fact, the only aggrieved party here. I refilled Bert's terrible coffee and asked him to write up a formal survey report. Meanwhile, Dolores had apparently noticed my cameras. The trail cam on the fence post is not exactly invisible once you know to look, and she called me again. This time, her tone had shifted from patrician dismissal to something a little more lawyerly. She told me the fill material was incidentally displaced during grading operations, and that the contractor had reasonable belief the property line was different from what I was claiming. She said the HOA would look into it. She also said, almost as an aside, that the HOA's Architectural Review Committee had been reviewing my rain collection system and my workshop outbuilding, and that they had concerns about whether these structures were compliant with Hargrove Estates community standards. And there it was, the play I'd been expecting. She was going to come at my property with her little HOA binder while simultaneously trying to bury the dumping issue in process and delay. I wrote down the time and content of that conversation in my composition notebook. I said, "Thank you, Dolores," and hung up again. 3 days later, I received by certified mail a formal HOA notice of violation for my workshop outbuilding and rain collection system, with a compliance deadline of 30 days and a daily fine of $50 after that. I set it on my workbench. I smiled, because she'd just handed me something I needed. Now, before I tell you what I did next, I need to explain something about HOA jurisdiction that most people don't know, and that Dolores, for all her bedazzled lanyard authority, had apparently never verified. HOAs have authority over properties within their declared CC and Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. These are recorded legal documents that run with the land, meaning they attach to a property when it's sold. The key word there is recorded. You record them against specific parcels, and those parcels have to be within the HOA's declared development. My property, 4417 Tulliver Road, was purchased in 2009. The Hargrove Estates development didn't exist until 2021. My deed predated theirs by 12 years. But here's where it gets interesting. When Ridgecrest Residential Partners filed their development plat and CC and Rs with Claremont County, they described the boundaries of the HOA's jurisdiction. I had never seen that document. Nobody had shown it to me. Nobody had told me I was being annexed into anything. But I had been receiving HOA communications. The HOA had apparently assessed dues on my property. I found this out later when I pulled the county records, and now they were issuing me formal violation notices. Either someone had made a very serious clerical error, or someone had deliberately included my parcel in their CC and R filing without my knowledge or consent. In Ohio, under the Planned Community Act, you cannot unilaterally add an existing, separately deeded property to a new HOA's jurisdiction without that property owner's written consent. It doesn't matter how close your fence line is. It doesn't matter if the developer thought it would be tidier. You need consent. In writing. Recorded. I had given no such consent. Takeaway. Check your county recorder's office. HOAs cannot legally annex your pre-existing property into their jurisdiction without your written, recorded consent. I pulled the full C&R document from the county recorder's website at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, sitting in my workshop with a cold cup of coffee, the fluorescent light buzzing softly above my head. I read all 64 pages of it. I used a yellow highlighter on the physical printout, and on page 41, in a section titled Boundary Description of Association Property, I found my parcel number, 4417 Tulliver Road, listed as a member parcel, assigned a dues assessment schedule, subject to all architectural review provisions. I sat very still for a moment. The creek frogs were loud that night. You could hear them through the open workshop window, that spring peeper sound, thousands of tiny voices, almost comically loud against the silence of what I'd just found. I went back inside and told Claudette. She looked at the page. She looked at me. She said, "Get a lawyer." She was right, and I already had one in mind. A property and real estate attorney named Forsyth Malik, who I'd worked with years earlier on a commercial easement dispute for my firm. Forsyth was a quiet, methodical man who wore bow ties and spoke softly, and had, in my experience, never lost a case involving a recorded document that someone hoped you wouldn't read carefully. I called him the next morning. We met at his office that Friday. I brought the composition notebook, the survey report from Bert, the trail camera footage, which I'd transferred to a thumb drive and organized by date, the photographs, the certified mail violation notice, and the CC&R document with my yellow highlights. Forsyth read through everything slowly, while I sat across from him and listened to the clock on his wall. When he finished, he folded his hands on the desk. "3 things," he said. "First, the dumping. You have clean documentation of illegal open dumping on your property. We file a civil complaint against the contractor and the HOA for remediation costs and damages. We also notify the county engineer about the easement encroachment. That triggers a separate enforcement action that you don't have to drive. Second, the unauthorized CC&R annexation. Your parcel was included in their filing without consent. That's a quiet title action. We go to court and get your parcel formally removed from their jurisdiction. While that's pending, any violation notices they issue are legally unenforceable." He paused. "Third," he said, "the dues. If they've been assessing dues against your parcel and those assessments were invalid, they owe you a refund, with interest." I asked him how much this was going to cost. Forsyth smiled, which he didn't do often. "Garrett," he said, "with the remediation costs alone, this isn't a cost question. This is a recovery question." I drove home in the early afternoon sunshine, the windows down, the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting in from someone's lawn along the county road. I felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, completely calm. Dolores Fitch had no idea what was about to happen to her construction schedule. Dolores escalated before we could file a single document. "I want you to appreciate the timing of this, because it's almost poetic. 2 days after my meeting with Forsyth, I received a second certified mail notice. The HOA was threatening to place a lien on my property for unpaid dues. 3 years of back-assessed dues, totaling $6,400, plus late fees. This is a tactic some HOAs use, and it is genuinely frightening if you don't know what it means. A lien can affect your ability to refinance or sell your home. It's designed to create urgency, to make you feel like the walls are closing in, to make you write a check and go away. What Dolores didn't know was that a lien filed against a property that has never validly been part of the HOA's jurisdiction is not a lien. It's a cloud on title. And a cloud on title filed by a party with no legal standing to file it is in Ohio a cause of action for slander of title, a tort that carries actual damages and in some cases punitive damages. She was handing me gifts. Forsyth filed 3 documents in the same week. The first was a formal complaint with the Claremont County Common Pleas Court, seeking a quiet title judgment removing my parcel from Hargrove Estates' CC and R jurisdiction. GK was a civil complaint against statewide grading and excavation and Ridgecrest Residential Partners for unlawful dumping, trespass, and remediation costs. We attached Bert's survey, the trail camera CDK, and the written log. The third was a formal notification to the Claremont County Engineer's Office, with Bert's survey documentation showing the encroachment on the county drainage easement. The County Engineer's Office moved faster than I expected. Within 10 days of our notification, they sent their own inspector out to the site. The inspector confirmed the encroachment. The county issued a formal stop work notice to Ridgecrest Residential Partners, not just for my corner of the property, but for the entire rear grading phase of the Hargrove Estates project, because the debris pile had compromised drainage grades that the county had approved as part of the development permit. Stop work on a 43-home development. In late spring, when every day of construction weather is worth money. Takeaway: when construction debris encroaches on a county drainage easement, the county itself becomes an enforcement party, and county stop work orders affect entire project permits, not just the problem area. I found out about the stop work order the morning it was posted. Bert called me, barely containing himself. "Garrett, have you looked out your back window?" I went out onto the back porch. The heavy equipment on the Ridgecrest site, the excavators, the compactors, the grading dozers, was sitting still, silent. The diesel smell that had been a constant background note in our mornings for 8 months was gone. The air smelled like creek water and clover. My neighbor across the road, a retired ironworker named Doyle Paxton, came walking over with 2 cups of coffee. He'd watched the whole sequence of events from a front row seat and had been quietly furious about the truck traffic and noise for months. "They stopped," he said, handing me a cup. "For now," I said. Doyle had his own history with Dolores. She'd sent him a violation notice for his holiday lights display in December. A sprawling, genuinely spectacular arrangement involving 500 feet of LED rope lights and an inflatable Santa that Doyle had named Gerald. He had a copy of that notice in a kitchen drawer. I made a mental note. The calls from Ridgecrest's legal team started 48 hours after the stop work order. A developer's attorney named Holterman called Forsyth seeking a good faith conversation about resolution. Forsyth relayed the offer. They would remove the debris at their expense, pay a flat settlement for the property damage, and drop the CC and R annexation of my parcel. Forsyth said, "Not enough." We countered. Full remediation at a licensed disposal facility, documented and certified. payment of all remediation-adjacent engineering costs, including Bert's survey, a formal legal removal of my parcel from their CC&R filing with a recorded correction deed, refund of all assessed dues with interest, and a recorded covenant that no future Hargrove Estates HOA communication or action could affect 4417 Tulliver Road in perpetuity. Holterman said his clients needed time to consider. I said that was fine. The stop work order wasn't going anywhere until the county engineer certified the drainage easement was clear. And the county engineer wasn't going to certify anything until the debris was removed. And the debris removal was a condition of our civil settlement. So the clock was running, and every day of stopped construction was costing Ridgecrest real money. Meanwhile, Dolores Fitch made a decision that was, in retrospect, the worst tactical move she could have made. She called a neighborhood meeting. The neighborhood meeting was held at the Hargrove Estates clubhouse, which was, at this point, a finished shell with folding chairs and a temporary HVAC unit rattling in the corner. About 30 residents showed up, most of them new homeowners who'd bought into the development in the past year and were now watching their HOA president preside over what was very publicly becoming a legal and regulatory disaster. Dolores's stated agenda was to present the board's position on the boundary dispute, her framing, and reassure homeowners that everything was under control. What she did not know was that 3 of those homeowners had already contacted me privately, introduced by Doyle Paxton, to share their own HOA grievances: a fine for a vegetable garden that was 3 inches too close to the property line, a violation notice for a pickup truck parked in a resident's own driveway, and a demand letter regarding wind chimes. I was not at the meeting. I was at home, in my workshop, reorganizing my file. But Doyle was there. He called me at 9:15 that night. "You're going to want to hear this," he said. At the meeting, under pressure from homeowners asking pointed questions about the stop work order and what it meant for their property values and construction timeline, Dolores had said something that would become extremely important. She had described the dumping situation as a proactive site management decision that the HOA board had voted to approve. She said the board had determined my back lot was effectively unused and had made a judgment call about temporary staging. The board had voted to approve. Doyle had his phone in his shirt pocket. He had recorded the whole meeting. This was significant for a reason that goes beyond the obvious. Up until that point, the legal theory around the dumping was that the contractor, Statewide Grading and Excavation, had acted on instructions from Ridgecrest Residential Partners, the developer. The HOA was a separate entity. Their liability was murkier. But if the HOA board had voted to approve the use of my property as a staging area, and their president had just said so on a recording in front of 30 witnesses, then the HOA had directorial liability for the trespass. That meant the HOA's insurance carrier was now in play. Forsyth, when I called him the next morning, took about 4 seconds to process this before he said, "Send me the recording." He sent a letter to the HOA's liability insurer the same day, notifying them of the recorded admission and our pending civil claims. Insurance carriers do not like surprise liability disclosures. They especially do not like them when the disclosure involves their insured's president making statements about board-approved trespass on recorded media. The insurer appointed their own counsel within a week. That counsel called Forsyth to discuss expedited resolution. But there was one more thing in the recording that Doyle flagged for me, almost casually, like he wasn't sure it mattered. At the end of the meeting, a homeowner had asked Dolores why my property was included in the HOA's CC&Rs in the first place, given that I was a pre-existing landowner who hadn't bought into the development. Dolores had said, "The developer's attorney handled the filings. We took it on faith that everything was in order." Took it on faith, which meant either the developer's attorney had made a significant professional error, or the inclusion of my parcel was deliberate, intended perhaps to give the HOA control over my land use and create exactly the kind of leverage they'd tried to use when they threatened me with violations and liens. Either way, someone with a bar license was about to have a very uncomfortable conversation. I started making a list of everyone who needed to know about this. The next 6 weeks were the most productive of my retired life. I want to walk you through what we built: the legal architecture, the physical documentation, and the community coalition. Because this is the part where the story becomes, I think, genuinely useful to anyone watching who's ever been pushed around by people in positions of petty authority. Forsyth and I mapped out what he called the three-track strategy. You run all three simultaneously, because each one creates pressure that reinforces the others, and the people on the other side can't defend in three directions at once. Track 1 was the civil litigation, the quiet title action, removing my parcel from the CC and Rs, was moving through the courts. Forsyth filed for a temporary restraining order, preventing the HOA from taking any enforcement action against my property while the case was pending. The judge granted it within a week. That killed the lien threat and voided every violation notice they'd issued. Dolores's whole enforcement playbook was now legally frozen. The civil complaint against statewide grading and Ridgecrest for the dumping and trespass was entering discovery. Their counsel had been dragging feet, but Forsyth filed a motion to compel production of their internal communications about the staging area decision. Internal emails, he explained to me, have a way of surfacing things people say when they think nobody's reading. He was right. We would see those emails in about 3 weeks, and they would not be flattering. Track 2 was the regulatory track. The county engineer's stop work order was still in place. We had also, quietly, filed a complaint with the Ohio EPA about the debris pile's proximity to the creek drainage corridor, because one of those concrete chunks had fractured, and some of the aggregate had migrated toward the easement during a rainstorm, and that is a stormwater quality issue that Ohio EPA takes seriously. The EPA sent their own inspector. Their inspector sent a letter. Now, Ridgecrest was managing 3 regulatory agencies simultaneously: the county engineer, the Ohio EPA, and the county's building and zoning department, which had reopened its permit review. Every day the stop work continued. Ridgecrest was burning holding costs on 43 lots. Real estate development at that scale runs on borrowed money. Carrying costs on a mid-size Ohio residential development can run $30,000 to $50,000 a month just in interest and overhead. We were into week 7 of the stop work order by this point. You do the math. Takeaway. Filing complaints with multiple regulatory agencies simultaneously creates overlapping enforcement. Each agency requires its own clearance before construction can resume, multiplying delay and cost. Track 3 was the community track, and this one I have to credit largely to Doyle and his remarkable network of people who were tired of being pushed around. Doyle had been quietly canvassing the Hargrove Estates residents, who'd approached him after my situation became public. He found 11 households with documented HOA violations that were, on review, legally questionable, issued against properties where, he suspected, the same sloppy CC and R paperwork might create similar jurisdiction problems. He also found 3 households whose residents were current or former members of county boards, planning commissions, or civic organizations. One of those residents, a woman named Priscilla Tauteberg, who'd served on the county planning commission for 6 years, had her own deep understanding of Ohio's community association law. She and I met at Doyle's kitchen table one Sunday afternoon. Coffee and county plat maps spread across the surface. The kitchen smelled of bacon grease and old newspaper, the way good working kitchens do. Priscilla had a yellow legal pad and moved through documents like a woman who did not believe in wasted time. She identified something Forsyth and I had not fully pursued. The developer's attorney who had drafted the CC and Rs and included my parcel without consent had also filed the development plat. That plat had been approved by the County Planning Commission, of which Priscilla had been a member. But the plat approval was conditioned on the developer certifying that all included parcels had given written consent to HOA membership. That certification had been filed. It included my parcel. It was false. A false certification to a county planning commission during a land use approval process is not a paperwork error. It is, depending on the circumstances, a fraudulent statement in a public record, which can trigger proceedings with the Ohio State Bar Association for the attorney involved. I added the Ohio State Bar to my list. Meanwhile, I was working on something physical, something Bert and I had been quietly planning since he completed his survey. The debris pile was coming down, eventually. That was already a condition of the settlement negotiation. But I wanted to document, permanently and visibly, exactly what had been done to my property, and exactly where the legal boundaries ran. So Bert and I located all 4 survey pins on my back lot and capped them in bright orange painted concrete monuments. We installed a new gate with a heavy-duty padlock, and we planted, along the entire back fence line, a row of native eastern red cedar saplings. The cedars would take 10 years to mature into a proper windbreak. That was fine. I plant for the long view. Desperate people make desperate moves. I want to be honest about this period because it wasn't comfortable, even for someone in my position. When an organization with lawyers and insurance money feels cornered, they don't necessarily give up gracefully. They try things. The first thing they tried was a smear. About a month into the court proceedings, a post appeared on the Hargrove Estates neighborhood social media group, which Doyle monitored on my behalf since I was not, and had never been, a member, suggesting that I was a litigious property owner who had a history of disputes with neighbors and was trying to hold up development that benefits the entire community. The post was anonymous, but the writing style matched Dolores's other communications closely enough that it wasn't a mystery. Forsyth sent the HOA's counsel a politely worded letter noting that defamatory statements made in the context of ongoing litigation could expand our damages claims. The post disappeared within 24 hours. The second thing they tried was a bribe. I don't know what else to call it. Ridgecrest's counsel sent Forsyth a revised settlement offer that included everything we'd asked for: full remediation, dues refund, CC&R correction, the recorded covenant, but also included a good neighbor payment of $15,000 in exchange for my signing a mutual release of all claims and a non-disparagement agreement. A non-disparagement agreement, meaning I couldn't talk about what happened. I called Forsyth. What happens, I asked, if I decline the non-disparagement clause? They lose the mutual release they want. You retain the right to discuss the facts of the case. The settlement still closes everything legally, but they don't get the silence. Decline it, I said. There was a pause. Garrett, Forsyth said, I want to make sure you understand. The $15,000 is a clean addition. It's not nothing. I know, I said. Decline it anyway. He did. Ridgecrest's counsel did not seem surprised. They counter-offered with a $10,000 good neighbor payment with no non-disparagement clause. We accepted that counter. The remediation, the dues refund with interest, the CC&R correction, GKR completed. The settlement was signed and the check was cut. But Dolores GK done. She had apparently decided that if she was going down, she was going to do it with maximum theater. She called a second homeowners meeting. This one open to the public, which meant Doyle was there with his phone. And so were 3 Hargrove Estates residents who had by this point retained their own attorney regarding their own HOA disputes. She presented a bored response to what she called coordinated legal harassment by a neighbor who never won a GK of our community. She said, at this meeting, "We have done nothing wrong. We acted in the best interests of Hargrove Estates, and we will be vindicated." GK. The problem was that by this point, the discovery process in our civil case had produced the internal emails Forsyth had asked for. And those emails, between the Ridgecrest project manager, the contractor supervisor at statewide grading, and a CC thread that included Dolores Fitch, made it absolutely, documentably clear that the decision to use my lot as a staging area had been made knowingly, that someone on that chain had specifically noted that the old guy on Tulliver probably won't know what hit him, and that Dolores had replied with, as long as it's handled before the model home opens. The old guy on Tulliver. That was me. 43 years of engineering, 30 years of professional licensing, a man who had literally built the infrastructure that their trucks drove on to get to that site, and I was the old guy on Tulliver. I've been called worse, but I've rarely been underestimated so completely. Forsyth moved to have those emails included in the court record, which, in Ohio civil proceedings, is a public document. Anyone could read them. Any journalist covering local development stories could find them with a courthouse search. One did. Priscilla Totberg was, among her other virtues, connected. She had served on the County Planning Commission. She was an active member of the Claremont County Civic League, and she knew a young reporter at the Claremont Courier named Thaddeus Binker, who covered local government and development with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely believed local journalism mattered. She made a phone call. Thaddeus requested the court file under Ohio public records law. It was a straightforward request. Civil court records in Ohio are presumptively public, and the courthouse provided the documents within the statutory period. He also filed a public records request with the county engineer's office for their inspection reports and stop work documentation, and with the county planning commission for the development plat and the certification that had included my parcel. While Thaddeus was doing his reporting, I was doing something I want to tell you about because it was, personally, the most satisfying part of this entire sequence. I was cleaning my back lot. The remediation crew, hired by Ridgecrest under the settlement agreement's terms, using a licensed disposal contractor whose documentation I was required to approve, came in on a Tuesday morning. 4 trucks, a compact excavator, and a crew foreman named Wiley, who handed me a clipboard before they started and said, "You want to initial each load ticket as we go?" Yes, Wiley. I absolutely did. Over 2 days, they removed all 22 tons of debris, each load documented, each ticket initialed. The disposal manifests showing the material going to a licensed C and D facility 40 miles north. When the last truck pulled out, I walked the lot with Bert, who came out again with his GPS and his terrible thermos. The lot was stripped back to bare subsoil in the disturbed area, which was less poetic than I'd hoped, but it was clean and it was certifiably clean. We reseeded with the same native grass mix I'd used before. I installed 2 new gate posts, set in concrete, with a proper gate. I replaced the survey caps that the heavy equipment had partially buried. The smell of freshly turned earth after 2 days of remediation work is not a romantic smell. It's wet clay and diesel and the vaguely metallic bite of disturbed soil. But underneath it, by the second afternoon, you could start to smell the creek again, that cool, slightly green smell of moving water and aquatic plants. The frogs had been quiet during the work. They came back the second evening. Doyle came over and stood at the fence line, looking at the cleaned lot. "Good," he said. That was the whole review. Meanwhile, the Ridgecrest project had resumed construction. The stop work order lifted once the remediation was certified and the drainage easement was clear. But they were now nearly 2 months behind schedule, operating with a revised permit that included additional drainage monitoring conditions, and carrying the reputational weight of a civil case whose court documents were now in a local reporter's hands. The HOA's insurance carrier had separately negotiated a settlement with Forsyth, covering the slander of title claim from the invalid lien, which added another layer of financial consequence to Dolores's board-approved decisions. The carrier's settlement came with conditions for the HOA, including mandatory review of all their CC&R filings and a requirement to hire an independent HOA management firm for a minimum of 2 years. Dolores was still president in name, but she was now operating under independent oversight that she had not chosen and could not control. The bar complaint against the developer's attorney, filed by Forsyth in coordination with the false certification in the plat documents, was under investigation. That process takes time. I cannot tell you how it resolved because, as of my telling of this story, it was still pending. But I can tell you that the attorney in question had, quietly, withdrawn from representing Ridgecrest Residential Partners. Thaddeus Binker's article ran on a Thursday, above the fold on the Claremont Courier's website, under the headline, "How a Retired Engineer's Backlot Stopped a $12 million Development in Its Tracks." The piece was careful, factual, and devastating. It quoted the court documents. It quoted Bert's survey. It quoted, with my permission, the email in which I was described as the old guy on Tulliver. He also quoted me. I had one thing I wanted to say. Thaddeus asked me what I wanted people to take away from the experience. "Read your deed," I said. "Read your county recorder filings. Learn where your property pins are, and document everything, from day one, because documentation is the one thing petty authority genuinely cannot fight." Thaddeus liked that. He made it the closing quote of the article. But the real closing was still coming, and it happened at the Hargrove Estates annual community meeting, 6 months after the debris trucks had first shown up on my land. The Hargrove Estates annual community meeting was held on a Saturday morning in October in the now completed clubhouse. The folding chairs had been replaced with proper banquet chairs. There was coffee and a tray of pastries on a folding table by the door. The room smelled of new carpet, an industrial air freshener, and the faint, sharp scent of anxiety. Dolores Fitch was at the front of the room, behind a folding table that served as the board's dais. She was wearing her lanyard. She had her reading glasses on her bedazzled chain. She had a stack of documents in front of her, and the particular posture of someone who has decided to project confidence, because the alternative is to show the room that the foundation underneath them has completely crumbled. There were approximately 60 people in that room. 43 were Hargrove Estates homeowners. 11 of them were the residents Doyle had connected with, the ones with their own documented HOA complaints. 3 of them had legal representation. One of them was Priscilla Tautberg, who had driven herself there in a sensible sedan and taken a seat in the second row with a notepad and a pen. Doyle was in the back, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who has waited a long time for something satisfying. I was in the third row. I had not told Dolores I was coming. I was not required to. I was no longer a member of the HOA. The court had issued its quiet title order 6 weeks earlier, formally removing 4417 Tulliver Road from the CC&R jurisdiction with prejudice. I was, technically, a guest. But the meeting was open to the community, and I was part of this community. Also present, Thaddeus Binker in the back row with a notebook. The meeting opened with the board's standard business: budget review, committee reports, the usual machinery of HOA governance. Dolores moved through it efficiently, in the manner of someone who hopes that procedural normalcy will reset the emotional temperature of the room. Then came the open comment period. The first person to stand was a homeowner named Alistair DeVore, a high school shop teacher who had received a violation notice for a vegetable garden and had, since connecting with Doyle, hired an attorney and discovered that his violation notice had been issued without the required advance notice period specified in the C&Rs themselves. He stated this calmly and asked the board for a formal written response. The second person was the woman with the wind chimes. Her name was Bernadette Holst. She had printed out the relevant Ohio HOA statute and the specific C&R provision the board had cited in her violation notice. She read both passages aloud. They did not say the same thing. The board's citation was wrong. She asked for a formal written response. The third person was Priscilla Tautberg. She did not stand dramatically. She did not raise her voice. She simply presented, in the calm tone of a former planning commissioner who has spent decades in public meetings, a summary of the false certification the developer's attorney had filed with the county, the certification that had included my parcel and, she had now documented, 3 other pre-existing adjacent parcels without their owner's consent. She named the attorney. She noted the bar complaint. She asked whether the current board had reviewed the filings for accuracy. Dolores said, "That matter is under investigation." Priscilla said, "Yes, it is." Then I stood up. I didn't have a prepared speech. I had a manila folder with documents in it, which I set on my chair when I stood. The room knew who I was. Thaddeus's article had made sure of that. "I'm not here to relitigate," I said. "The courts handled that. I'm here because I live on Tulliver Road, and you are my neighbors, and I think you deserve to know what was done in the name of this HOA. I described briefly and factually what had happened: the dumping, the CC&R annexation, the invalid lien, the emails. I quoted the email. "The old guy on Tulliver." I said it without particular anger. I let it sit. Then I set the manila folder on the folding table in front of the board. "That's a copy of the quiet title order, the settlement agreement, the remediation certificates, and the court's findings, for the record." Dolores looked at the folder. She did not open it. In the back of the room, Thaddeus Binker was writing steadily. 3 weeks later, Dolores Fitch resigned as HOA president, citing personal reasons. The independent management firm the insurance carrier had mandated took over full administration. Forsyth sent me a brief email. "Quiet title is in the deed record. You're clear." I printed that email. I tacked it to the wall of my workshop, next to the survey map with the orange-capped pins marked on it. And then I went outside to water my cedar saplings. I want to tell you what came after, because I think the after matters as much as the fight. The $10,000 good neighbor payment from Ridgecrest, the one I'd declined to trade for silence, and the dues refund with interest, which came to $4,300, sat in a separate account while I thought about what to do with them. Claudette had a suggestion almost immediately. "The creek," she said. She was right. The drainage easement that runs along our back lot connects to Tulliver Creek, which connects to a larger county watershed that has been under an informal restoration program for several years. Native plantings, erosion control, water quality monitoring. run by a local conservation group called Claremont Watershed Partners, staffed largely by volunteers, chronically underfunded. We donated $12,000, the payment, the refund, and a contribution of our own, to the Claremont Watershed Partners Tulliver Creek Restoration Project. The money funded a professional hydrological assessment of the creek corridor, 2 seasons of native riparian plantings along the eastern bank, and the installation of 3 water quality monitoring stations that now submit data quarterly to the Ohio EPA. The creek sounds better. I mean that literally. The restoration work has improved the riffle structure in the reach behind our property, and on still mornings, you can hear the water moving over the gravel bars more clearly than you could before. The spring peepers are back in force. Claudette saw a great blue heron last month standing in the shallows about 30 yards from our back fence. She texted me a photo. I have it as my phone wallpaper. Doyle Paxton organized what became an annual Tulliver Road block party. The first one happened the summer after the resolution, on a hot July Saturday, with a borrowed smoker and Doyle's inflatable Gerald making his triumphant comeback. About 40 people came. Alistair DeVore brought his family. Bernadette Holst brought wind chimes for everybody. Priscilla Tautberg brought a pie and a binder of property rights resources that she'd compiled for anyone who wanted them. Bert came. He brought his terrible thermos. Forsyth sent his regrets, but mailed a card. Some of the Hargrove Estates homeowners came too, the newer ones, the ones who'd bought houses in good faith and had nothing to do with Dolores or the board's decisions. They were good people who'd ended up in a badly run organization through no fault of their own. We fed them brisket. Community doesn't require unanimity. It just requires showing up. Dolores Fitch eventually moved, I'm told, to a retirement community in Florida. I wish her well. I mean that. I don't carry grudges. I just carry documentation. The Ridgecrest development finished. Hargrove Estates is a real neighborhood now. The independent management firm runs a tight, legally sound operation. Several of the original residents have told me they think the HOA is actually better now than it would have been. That might be true. Losing badly sometimes teaches what winning couldn't. My cedar saplings are doing fine. 4 feet tall, maybe a little more, by last measure. 10 more years and there'll be a proper windbreak. I'll be in my late 70s by then. I plan to enjoy every one of those years.
So that's what 22 tons of concrete, 1 bedazzled lanyard, and 0 respect for property law actually cost you. Dolores lost her presidency. The development lost 2 months, and a number I won't say out loud, but let's just call it significant. And Garrett backlot, clean, certified. Every survey piece was right where it always was. 15 years of work, restores. Here's what I keep coming back to with this one. Garrett didn't win because he got angry. He didn't win because he posted about it online or showed up screaming at a board meeting. He won because when that first truck backed through his fence line, he set down his coffee and he started writing things down. A composition notebook, a trail camera rig tied to a fence post, a Saturday morning phone call to an old friend with a surveyor kit and bad thermos of coffee. That was the whole weapon. Petty authority scouts on you not knowing where your rights end, and their risk begins. Garrett knew. And that knowledge, not anger, not money, not connections, is what buried their entire construction schedule. If this one hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. And tell me in the comments, what's the most absurd thing a HOA has ever tried to push on you? I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, because the next story makes this one look like a noise complaint. Know your pins, read your deed, document everything.